Richard Holloway thought humiliating the quiet woman in front of the executive board would make him look powerful. But before the day was over, he would discover that the woman he ordered to serve coffee controlled the future of the entire company. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and help support more stories that remind the world why dignity still matters. The 42nd floor of Holloway Financial Group overlooked downtown Chicago like a kingdom built from glass and steel. Morning sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, while polished marble floors echoed beneath expensive Italian shoes and hurried executive footsteps. Assistants moved quickly through the towering lobby, carrying tablets, schedules, and coffee trays as senior managers prepared for the company's most important investor meeting in nearly a decade. Inside the private executive conference room, tension hung thick in the air. A $12 billion acquisition was on the table, and everyone knew the mysterious investor funding the expansion had remained completely anonymous throughout the negotiations. Richard Holloway stood at the center of the room, adjusting the cufflinks on his charcoal gray suit, while junior executives listened carefully to every word he said. At 52 years old, Richard had mastered the art of commanding attention. His silver watch gleamed beneath the recessed lighting, and his voice carried the kind of arrogance that came from decades of unchecked authority. "I want this room flawless before the investors arrive," he barked while scanning the long walnut conference table. "No mistakes today. One bad impression could cost us everything." Several assistants nodded nervously. Then the glass doors opened quietly behind him. A woman stepped into the room carrying a slim leather folder against her side. She wore a cream-colored sweater beneath a simple beige coat, her blonde hair tied neatly behind her shoulders. At first glance, she looked almost invisible among the sea of tailored suits and polished executives. Calm, quiet, completely understated, Evelyn Carter paused near the doorway, observing the room with steady blue eyes while executives rushed around preparing presentations. She said nothing. Richard barely looked at her before assuming she belonged to administrative staff. "You," he snapped suddenly, pointing toward the refreshment station near the back wall. "We're short on support staff this morning. Start pouring coffee for the board members before they arrive." The room fell awkwardly quiet for half a second. A younger analyst named Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Evelyn calmly met Richard's gaze. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, only silence. Richard mistook her composure for obedience. "Well," he said impatiently, "move a little faster. Investors don't like waiting." A few executives exchanged subtle smirks while others avoided eye contact altogether. Public humiliation had become normal under Richard Holloway's leadership. He enjoyed reminding people where they stood. Evelyn slowly placed her leather folder onto the edge of the conference table before walking toward the silver coffee service near the wall. The polished heels of her shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, while sunlight spilled across the skyline behind her. Daniel noticed something strange then. The company's CEO, Martin Grayson, had just entered through the side doors carrying his tablet, but the moment he saw Evelyn standing beside the coffee station, his expression changed completely. The color drained slightly from his face. He straightened his posture immediately. For a brief moment, it looked as though he was about to walk directly toward her. But before he could speak, Richard continued talking loudly to the room. "Today is about professionalism," he announced confidently. "The people funding this acquisition expect excellence. They expect class. Anyone who embarrasses this company in front of our investors will answer to me personally." Evelyn quietly poured coffee into porcelain cups, while the city skyline shimmered behind the glass walls. No one in the room noticed the faint glance exchanged between her and the CEO. No one realized the nervous tension suddenly building among the senior board members, entering one by one through the side entrance. And Richard Holloway certainly had no idea that the quiet woman standing beside the coffee tray already owned more power in that building than he ever would. The scent of dark roast coffee drifted quietly through the executive conference room, while the tension inside Holloway Financial Group continued tightening like a wire ready to snap. Outside the towering glass windows, downtown Chicago moved in its usual rhythm far below. Yellow taxis threading through traffic, while cold November sunlight reflected across neighboring skyscrapers. But on the 42nd floor, nobody was paying attention to the view anymore. Every executive in the room was focused on the billion-dollar acquisition meeting that could redefine the company forever. Richard Holloway stood confidently near the massive digital presentation screen with one hand inside his pocket, speaking with the polished certainty of a man who believed the building belonged to him. "The investors are expecting discipline," he said sharply while scanning the room. "I do not want distractions today. We are dealing with people who understand power." Several board members nodded carefully, though a few exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the atmosphere felt strange. Too tense. Too quiet. Near the back wall, Evelyn Carter moved calmly between the conference chairs, carrying a polished silver coffee pot. She poured each cup carefully without speaking, her expression unreadable beneath the soft light hanging from the ceiling. The cream-colored sleeve of her sweater brushed lightly against the dark porcelain cups, while executives barely acknowledged her presence. To them, she was simply another invisible employee in a corporate tower filled with invisible people. Richard enjoyed that imbalance. It made him feel larger. "Black coffee for Mr. Bennett," he ordered casually without even looking at her. "And make sure the investors have bottled water ready before they arrive." Evelyn simply nodded once. No irritation. No reaction. Her silence unsettled Daniel Moore with every passing minute. The young analyst sat near the far end of the table, pretending to review financial projections, but his attention kept drifting toward the quiet woman Richard continued dismissing in front of everyone. He had noticed the way Chief Executive Officer Martin Grayson kept glancing nervously toward her. It did not make sense. Martin Grayson was a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, respected by banks, feared by competitors, and impossible to intimidate. Yet every time Evelyn crossed the room, the chief executive officer seemed suddenly cautious, almost careful. Then came another strange moment. One of the senior board members entered carrying a leather briefcase and immediately froze after spotting Evelyn near the refreshment station. His posture straightened instantly. "Good morning," he said quietly toward her with unexpected respect in his voice. Evelyn gave a polite smile. "Good morning, Thomas." Richard noticed the interaction and frowned slightly. "You two know each other?" he asked. Thomas hesitated for half a second too long. "I believe we met briefly during the preliminary reviews." Richard waved dismissively. "Well, today is about real decision-makers." A faint silence settled across the room after those words. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the coffee tray while Thomas slowly took his seat without responding. Daniel could almost feel the discomfort spreading around the table now. Some executives suddenly avoided looking at Richard altogether. Others began whispering quietly among themselves. But Richard either did not notice or simply did not care. His confidence only grew stronger as more people entered the room. "By the end of today," he announced proudly, "this company will finally become what it was always meant to be." Then he turned toward Evelyn again. "And next time you serve coffee," he added coldly, "try not to hover around the executives while they are talking business." The room went completely silent. Even the air itself seemed to pause. Evelyn looked directly at him for the first time since entering the conference room. Her blue eyes remained calm, steady, almost impossible to read. And somewhere deep inside the room, several board members suddenly realized Richard Holloway had just made a catastrophic mistake. The silence hanging over the conference room did not disappear after Richard Holloway's remark. It only deepened. Beneath the soft glow of recessed lighting and the faint hum of climate control vents, senior executives shifted carefully in their leather chairs while pretending to focus on spreadsheets projected across the massive presentation screen. but nobody seemed fully present anymore. Something invisible had changed inside the room. Richard simply had not noticed it yet. Evelyn Carter returned the silver coffee pot to the refreshment station with slow, measured movements before quietly stepping aside near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The skyline behind her shimmered beneath pale winter sunlight, turning the glass walls of the tower into mirrors of steel and gold. She folded her hands calmly in front of her, while conversations resumed in uneasy fragments around the table. Richard continued speaking confidently about market expansion, acquisitions, and investor leverage as if he were already celebrating victory. "This company needs stronger leadership moving forward," he declared while clicking through financial slides. "The old culture has been too soft for too long. Investors respect authority, not hesitation." A few executives nodded automatically, though others remained strangely quiet. Daniel noticed Chief Executive Officer Martin Grayson rubbing his jaw nervously while glancing repeatedly toward his phone. Sweat had begun forming near his temple despite the cool temperature inside the room. Then another interruption arrived. The executive assistant opened the conference doors carefully and stepped inside carrying a black folder against her chest. "Sir," she said cautiously toward Martin Grayson, "the investor representatives have arrived downstairs." Richard smiled immediately. Perfect timing. He straightened his suit jacket proudly before turning toward the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment that secures our future." But the assistant did not move. Instead, she looked uncertainly toward Evelyn for the briefest second before returning her eyes to the chief executive officer. Martin noticed it immediately. So did Daniel. Richard did not. "Should I escort them up now?" the assistant asked quietly. Martin hesitated. "Yes," he answered carefully. "And make sure everything is prepared exactly as requested." The assistant nodded before quickly leaving the room. Richard leaned casually against the edge of the conference table. "These investors have been impossible to read," he said with a smug chuckle. "Anonymous negotiations, private legal teams, last-minute demands. People with that much money always enjoy making an entrance." Nobody laughed with him. The room remained tense. One senior board member cleared his throat awkwardly before lowering his eyes toward the table again. Another adjusted his tie repeatedly while avoiding direct eye contact with Evelyn entirely. Richard finally began noticing the strange mood around him. "What is wrong with everyone today?" he asked with irritation creeping into his voice. "You all look like you are waiting for a funeral." No one answered. Then came another detail Richard failed to understand. Martin Grayson quietly stood from his chair the moment the private elevator indicator beside the conference room lit up. Several board members immediately followed his lead, straightening their jackets and fixing their posture almost instinctively. Even Thomas Bennett rose to his feet without hesitation. Richard frowned in confusion. "Relax," he said dismissively. "You are acting like royalty is about to walk in here." The private elevator doors opened softly across the hall. Footsteps echoed against marble floors outside the conference room. Calm, measured, unhurried. Every conversation inside the room stopped instantly. Even the sound of papers moving disappeared. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as he noticed something else. Evelyn Carter had not moved toward the door with the others. She simply remained standing near the windows, perfectly composed, as though she already knew exactly what was about to happen. Richard looked around the room one final time, still completely unaware that the people entering this floor were not coming to meet him. They were coming for her. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft, mechanical whisper that somehow sounded louder than anything else in the building. Every executive standing around the conference table immediately straightened their posture, while polished shoes shifted nervously across the marble floor. The atmosphere inside the room changed so suddenly, it felt almost physical, like pressure building before a storm. 3 people stepped out from the elevator dressed in dark, tailored coats, carrying slim leather portfolios and speaking quietly among themselves. At the center walked an older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, known throughout the financial world as Charles Whitmore, senior legal counsel for Blackstone Ridge Capital. Richard Holloway recognized him instantly. His confidence sharpened immediately. Finally, Richard said with a broad smile while stepping forward, "Welcome to Holloway Financial Group. I am Richard Holloway, Senior Operations Director." Charles Whitmore barely acknowledged him. Instead, his eyes moved calmly past Richard and toward the far side of the room where Evelyn Carter still stood near the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The older attorney's expression softened immediately. "Ms. Carter," he said respectfully, "I apologize for the delay downstairs." The room froze. Richard's smile remained on his face for one confused second longer before slowly fading away. Evelyn offered a calm nod. "No problem at all, Charles." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Several executives looked toward Richard instinctively, waiting for him to correct whatever misunderstanding they assumed had just happened. But Richard himself suddenly looked uncertain. "Wait," he interrupted awkwardly. "You know her?" Charles Whitmore turned slowly toward him. The silence in the room became unbearable. "Of course," the attorney replied carefully. "Ms. Evelyn Carter is the principal investor behind the Blackstone Acquisition Partnership." A hush fell across the conference room. Daniel felt his stomach drop instantly. One executive nearly lost grip of the tablet in his hands, while another slowly lowered himself back into his chair as though his legs had weakened beneath him. Richard blinked several times, unable to process the words he had just heard. "There must be some mistake," he said with a forced laugh. "She is with support staff." Nobody answered him. Evelyn stepped away from the windows with calm, measured movements and walked slowly toward the head of the conference table. The sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed through the silence like a countdown. Martin Grayson immediately pulled out the chair at the head position for her without hesitation. Richard noticed it. Everyone noticed it. The chief executive officer of Holloway Financial Group was personally seating the quiet woman he had ordered to pour coffee less than an hour earlier. Charles Whitmore carefully placed a thick black folder onto the conference table and opened it toward the board members. As outlined in the finalized agreements, he continued professionally, "Ms. Carter currently controls 51% of the acquisition capital funding this merger and holds authority over the restructuring recommendations moving forward." Several board members exchanged stunned glances. Richard's face slowly lost color. 51%? He repeated quietly. Evelyn finally sat down at the head of the table, folding her hands calmly in front of her while sunlight reflected softly behind her across the glass walls. Her expression remained composed, controlled, almost impossibly calm considering the humiliation she had endured all morning. Richard suddenly remembered every word he had spoken to her, every order, every dismissive glance, every public insult delivered in front of the board. He felt heat rise into his face. "Why did nobody tell me?" he demanded toward Martin Grayson. But even the chief executive officer no longer seemed interested in protecting him. Martin adjusted his tie nervously before answering. "The investor identity was confidential until the contracts finalized this morning." Richard opened his mouth again, but no words came out this time. Around the conference room, executives who had laughed quietly at Evelyn earlier now refused to meet her eyes. No one smiled anymore. No one whispered. The room that once belonged to Richard Holloway no longer felt like his at all. And for the first time in years, the powerful executive realized what true silence sounded like when respect had completely disappeared. Richard Holloway remained standing beside the conference table, while the reality of the situation settled over the room like cold winter fog. The polished confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone now, replaced by something far more fragile. Around him, senior executives avoided eye contact while pretending to reorganize documents that no longer held their attention. Nobody seemed interested in Richard's authority anymore. Their focus had shifted entirely toward Evelyn Carter. Sunlight spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, outlining her calm silhouette against the Chicago skyline, while Charles Whitmore distributed finalized merger packets across the table. The quiet woman Richard had treated like invisible staff now sat at the head of the most important meeting in company history. And somehow, she still carried herself with more grace than anyone else in the room. "Before we proceed," Charles said professionally while adjusting his glasses, "Ms. Carter requested a full internal leadership review as part of the acquisition terms." Richard looked up sharply. "Leadership review?" Charles nodded once. "Operational culture, executive conduct, employee retention metrics, and workplace ethics evaluations." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Martin Grayson lowered his eyes toward the table. Richard suddenly understood why everyone had been acting nervous all morning. This acquisition had never been just about money. It was about control. Evelyn finally spoke again for the first time since the reveal, her voice calm and steady beneath the soft hum of the conference room lights. "I have spent the last 6 months reviewing this company quietly," she said. "Not just the numbers, the people." The room listened carefully. Even the air itself seemed still. "Financial reports can tell you whether a company is profitable," Evelyn continued, "but they cannot tell you whether people feel respected when they walk into work every morning." Richard swallowed hard. A faint pulse flickered in his jaw. Evelyn's eyes moved slowly around the conference table before settling on him briefly. Not angry, not emotional, simply observant. That somehow felt worse. "Culture always reveals leadership," she said quietly, "especially when someone believes nobody important is watching." A hush fell across the room. Daniel looked down at his notes immediately, trying to hide the tension written across his face. Several executives suddenly appeared deeply interested in their laptops. No one wanted to be caught reacting. Richard forced a nervous chuckle. "I think perhaps there has been some misunderstanding this morning," he said carefully while adjusting his tie. "Pressure can create unfortunate impressions." Evelyn did not answer immediately. She simply reached toward the silver coffee cup sitting near her folder and took a slow sip, the same coffee he had ordered her to serve. The silence stretched painfully long. "No," she replied softly at last. "I do not believe there was any misunderstanding." Richard froze completely. Charles Whitmore calmly slid another document across the table toward the board members. "As part of the transition," he explained, "Ms. Carter now holds final approval authority regarding executive restructuring recommendations effective immediately." The words landed heavily across the room. Richard's expression tightened. "Restructuring?" he repeated. Martin Grayson finally spoke, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "The board agreed to cooperate fully with the investor review process." Richard turned toward him in disbelief. "You already discussed this." No one answered him directly. That silence told him everything. Evelyn folded her hands together neatly atop the table while watching him with composed eyes. "Leadership is not measured by how loudly someone gives orders," she said quietly. "It is measured by how they treat people who appear to have no power at all." Richard looked around desperately for support, but nobody came to his defense. Not one executive, not one board member. Even those who had laughed alongside him earlier now sat completely silent. He was alone. For the first time in years, Richard Holloway understood what it felt like to stand at the bottom of a room instead of the top. And somewhere deep beneath the polished ceilings and billion-dollar contracts, the entire company was beginning to realize that the quietest person in the building had been the most powerful all along. The atmosphere inside the conference room no longer resembled a celebration of corporate success. It felt more like a courtroom where everyone already knew the verdict before a single word was spoken. Outside the towering glass walls, snow had begun drifting lightly across downtown Chicago, soft white flakes moving slowly between the steel skyscrapers, while gray clouds dimmed the afternoon sunlight. Inside Holloway Financial Group, however, nobody noticed the weather anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Evelyn Carter. Richard Holloway sat rigidly in his chair now, the confidence that once filled his voice replaced by strained silence. His expensive charcoal suit suddenly looked less impressive than it had that morning. Around the conference table, board members reviewed the restructuring documents Charles Whitmore had distributed moments earlier. The faint sound of turning pages echoed through the room like whispers at a funeral. Then another executive entered quietly carrying a slim tablet. "Excuse me," she said carefully toward Martin Grayson. Human Resources completed the preliminary review request. Martin nodded stiffly and accepted the tablet without speaking. Richard watched the exchange nervously. Something cold settled deep in his stomach. Evelyn remained calm, her hands folded neatly atop the conference table while Charles reviewed acquisition terms beside her. Not once had she raised her voice. Not once had she tried humiliating Richard in return. That restraint somehow made the situation even heavier. As part of the transition review, Charles explained professionally, employee retention surveys and leadership conduct reports were evaluated over the last 2 fiscal years. Richard forced himself to speak. Surely isolated complaints should not outweigh operational performance. Charles looked toward him evenly. There were not isolated complaints. Silence, heavy, immediate. Martin slowly slid the tablet across the table toward Richard without meeting his eyes. Richard looked down at the screen. His face tightened almost instantly. Anonymous employee reports filled the display. Patterns of intimidation. Public humiliation during meetings. Excessive staff turnover. Junior employees resigning after executive confrontations. Several board members quietly lowered their eyes. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he realized many incidents described inside the report had happened directly in front of people who said nothing. Richard read faster now, his jaw clenching harder with every passing second. Then he froze completely after reaching the final page. A recommendation notice from the Executive Ethics Committee stared back at him in black lettering. Immediate leadership suspension pending board review. Richard looked up sharply. "This is absurd," he said quietly, though even he no longer sounded convinced. "I built operational growth for this company." Evelyn finally turned toward him fully. Her expression remained steady. "Growth without dignity eventually destroys itself," she said softly. The room fell silent again. Richard looked around desperately as though searching for someone willing to defend him, but nobody spoke. Not Martin, not the board, not the executives who had once laughed at his jokes and praised his authority. Power had shifted too completely now. Charles Whitmore calmly closed one of the legal folders. "Effective immediately," he announced. "All restructuring authority transfers to interim leadership pending final board review next week." Richard blinked slowly. "You are removing me?" Martin finally found the courage to answer. "The board voted unanimously 30 minutes ago." Richard stared at him in disbelief. Before this meeting even started, Martin swallowed hard. The investors requested immediate action after reviewing internal conduct reports. A faint hush spread through the room. Richard leaned back slowly into his chair, staring at the polished walnut table where only hours earlier he had ordered Evelyn to serve coffee like invisible staff. The memory hit him all at once now. Every dismissive remark, every careless assumption, every moment he believed appearance defined value. Evelyn rose calmly from her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater before gathering her folder. No triumph crossed her face. No satisfaction, only quiet disappointment. She paused briefly beside Richard before speaking one final time. The strongest leaders in a building are usually the ones who never need to remind people they are important. Richard lowered his eyes. Around the room, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And in the crushing silence that followed, every person sitting inside that glass tower understood they had just witnessed the difference between authority and true power. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Holloway Financial Group had transformed completely. The towering glass headquarters that once echoed with hurried footsteps and sharp executive voices now carried a strange, cautious quiet through its marble hallways. Employees moved more slowly than usual, whispering in corners near elevators and break rooms, while rumors spread floor by floor faster than any official announcement could contain. Everyone had heard some version of the story already. The senior director had publicly humiliated a quiet woman only to discover she controlled the company's future. But what unsettled people most was not the power reversal itself. It was how calmly Evelyn Carter had handled it. Inside the executive conference room, the formal meeting had finally adjourned, though very few people rushed to leave. Board members lingered behind reviewing restructuring documents, while legal teams quietly gathered folders and financial reports from the table. Outside the massive windows, Chicago's skyline glowed beneath fading afternoon light as snow continued drifting softly between the buildings. Richard Holloway remained seated alone near the far end of the conference table long after most executives had already exited. His tie hung slightly loose now. The sharp confidence that once defined every movement had vanished beneath visible exhaustion. For the first time in years, nobody approached him for approval. Nobody waited for instructions. Nobody seemed eager to stand near him at all. Across the room, Daniel quietly packed his laptop into a messenger bag while pretending not to notice Richard sitting there in silence. Earlier that morning, Richard had commanded the room with effortless authority. Now even junior analysts avoided making eye contact with him. Power inside corporate towers shifted quickly once fear disappeared. Then came another unexpected moment. A middle-aged administrative assistant named Karen entered carefully, carrying several personnel folders against her chest. Richard recognized her instantly. She had worked in the building for nearly 18 years. Normally, she barely spoke above a whisper around executives, but today felt different. Karen paused briefly beside Martin Grayson before quietly handing him another folder. Additional human resources complaints were submitted this afternoon. As she explained softly, Martin nodded grimly. Richard stared at the folders. More complaints? Karen looked at him for one brief moment before lowering her eyes again. People are no longer afraid to report things, she answered quietly. The room fell silent again. That single sentence somehow landed harder than every legal document before it. Richard looked away immediately. Around the building, the culture he had controlled through intimidation was already beginning to crack open. Employees who once stayed silent were finally speaking honestly. Junior staff members whispered stories near elevators. Receptionists discussed executive behavior openly during lunch breaks. Human resources inboxes filled faster by the hour, and at the center of it all stood Evelyn Carter, not demanding revenge, not humiliating anyone publicly, but quietly exposing what had always been there beneath the polished corporate image. Near sunset, Evelyn stepped out from Martin Grayson's private office, carrying her leather folder beneath one arm. Several employees standing near the reception area immediately straightened nervously as she approached, but unlike Richard, Evelyn acknowledged each of them with calm politeness. "Good evening," she said softly while passing the front desk. The receptionist looked almost stunned after hearing those words from someone so powerful. Daniel noticed it immediately. Respect flowed differently from fear. One created silence, the other created dignity. As Evelyn waited near the elevators, Martin caught up beside her. "I should have intervened earlier today," he admitted quietly. Evelyn looked toward the fading skyline beyond the lobby windows before answering. Most people wait until power changes sides before they decide what is right. Martin lowered his eyes. He knew she was correct. The elevator doors opened softly. Before stepping inside, Evelyn glanced once more across the lobby where employees now moved with a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. The building felt lighter somehow, calmer. As the elevator doors closed slowly behind her, several workers watched in silence. And for the first time in a very long time, the people inside Holloway Financial Group began to believe their voices might finally matter. That evening, the upper floors of Holloway Financial Group glowed against the dark Chicago skyline like a silent monument to everything that had changed in a single day. Snow continued falling softly outside the towering glass walls, while the city below blurred beneath ribbons of headlights and winter fog. Most employees had already gone home, but lights still burned inside several executive offices where attorneys, board members, and senior staff quietly worked through the aftermath of the acquisition meeting. The building no longer carried the sharp tension that once followed Richard Holloway through every hallway. Instead, an unfamiliar calm had settled over the company. Near 7:30 that evening, Evelyn Carter stood alone beside the windows inside the executive lounge overlooking Lake Michigan. She held a ceramic coffee cup between her hands while studying the city lights far below. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the dark glass, calm and composed as always. The door behind her opened carefully. Richard stepped into the lounge wearing his overcoat draped over one arm. For the first time all day, he no longer looked like a powerful executive. He simply looked tired, older somehow. The confidence that once filled every room ahead of him had disappeared completely. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Richard hesitated near the doorway before speaking. "I almost left without saying anything," he admitted quietly. Evelyn finally turned toward him, her expression unreadable beneath the warm amber lighting. "But," she asked softly. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. "But I realized silence would only make me more of a coward than I already was." The room fell quiet again. Somewhere beyond the lounge walls, elevators hummed softly through the building, while distant office phones rang faintly several floors below. Richard stepped farther into the room slowly. "I owe you an apology," he said carefully. "Not because of your position, not because of the acquisition, because of the way I treated you before I knew who you were." Evelyn watched him calmly without interrupting. Richard swallowed hard. "I spent years convincing myself that strength meant control," he continued. "Titles, authority, fear. I thought leadership meant making people feel small so they would never challenge me." His voice tightened slightly near the end of the sentence. "And today, I realized I built an entire career around the wrong idea." Evelyn set her coffee cup down gently on the table beside her. "Most people in power reveal their character the moment they believe someone beneath them cannot fight back," she said quietly. Richard nodded once. He could not argue with that anymore. The truth of it sat too heavily in his chest now. "I embarrassed myself," he admitted softly. "No," Evelyn replied calmly. "You revealed yourself." The words landed with quiet precision, not cruel, not dramatic, simply honest. Richard looked away toward the city lights below. Snowflakes drifted slowly past the windows while silence stretched between them again. Yet somehow it no longer felt hostile, just real. "What happens to me now?" he asked after a long pause. Evelyn folded her arms lightly against the cold glass behind her. "That depends on whether today changes you or merely humiliates you." Richard looked at her carefully then, perhaps for the first time all day truly seeing her beyond titles, wealth, or power. He saw restraint, intelligence, dignity, and something even rarer inside corporate towers filled with ego, humanity. Evelyn picked up her coat from the chair beside her. "People do not remember leaders because they were feared," she said softly while walking toward the door. "They remember how they felt after standing in the same room with them." Richard remained motionless as she passed him. The scent of coffee and winter air lingered faintly behind her, while the lounge doors closed softly in her wake. Alone beside the darkened skyline, Richard Holloway stood in silence staring at his own reflection in the glass. And for the first time in many years, he no longer liked the man looking back at him. 3 months later, winter had finally loosened its grip on Chicago. Morning sunlight poured across the glass exterior of Holloway Financial Group, reflecting against nearby skyscrapers, while streams of employees crossed the downtown sidewalks carrying coffee cups and laptop bags beneath clear blue skies. But inside the company tower, something far more important than the season had changed. The atmosphere no longer felt cold. Receptionists smiled openly, now instead of nervously lowering their eyes, whenever executives passed by. Junior analysts spoke during meetings without fear of humiliation. Even the marble hallways seemed quieter in a different way, not from tension, but from relief. The culture inside the building had slowly transformed under new leadership. Evelyn Carter never demanded dramatic announcements or public praise after the acquisition finalized. In fact, many employees rarely saw her at all. She preferred quiet oversight to grand entrances. Most mornings, she arrived early, carrying the same simple leather folder and wearing the same understated neutral-colored coats that made people underestimate her from the beginning. But now, whenever she entered the lobby, employees greeted her with genuine respect instead of nervous obligation. Respect built from dignity always lasted longer than fear. On the 42nd floor, the executive conference room looked almost identical to the day everything changed. The same walnut table stretched beneath recessed lighting. The same skyline framed the glass walls overlooking Lake Michigan, yet the energy inside the room felt entirely different now. During leadership meetings, executives listened carefully instead of competing for attention. Assistants sat at the table when discussing operational concerns. Human resources reports were reviewed seriously instead of quietly ignored. And for the first time in years, employee retention numbers had begun improving dramatically. Daniel noticed it more than anyone. Just 6 months earlier, he had considered leaving the company entirely after watching talented coworkers burn out beneath toxic leadership. Now, he found himself mentoring new analysts who actually looked excited to build careers there. One afternoon after a quarterly review meeting, Daniel paused near the conference room windows while Evelyn gathered her papers calmly at the head of the table. "Can I ask you something?" he said carefully. Evelyn looked up with a small, polite smile. "Of course." Daniel hesitated. "Why did you stay quiet that day?" he asked. "You could have revealed who you were immediately. You could have stopped everything before it started." Evelyn glanced briefly toward the skyline outside before answering. "Because people reveal their truest character when they believe there is nothing to gain from kindness." Daniel fell silent. The truth inside those words settled deeply into the room. Near sunset that same evening, another familiar figure stepped quietly through the executive lobby downstairs. Richard Holloway no longer wore expensive tailored suits or carried the commanding presence that once made entire departments nervous. After the board review, he had resigned formally from the company. Rumors said he had spent the last few months consulting for smaller firms while rebuilding both his reputation and himself. Some people believed humiliation had destroyed him, but the truth was more complicated than that. Certain lessons only arrive after pride collapses. Richard paused briefly near the reception desk before leaving a handwritten envelope addressed to Evelyn Carter. The receptionist accepted it carefully. "Would you like me to tell her you stopped by?" she asked politely. Richard looked toward the towering glass elevators for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he answered softly. "She already taught me everything I needed to hear." Then he walked quietly out into the fading Chicago evening while golden sunlight reflected across the city streets beyond the revolving doors. Upstairs, Evelyn later opened the envelope alone inside her office. Inside was a simple handwritten note. "Thank you for showing me the difference between power and respect. Nothing more." Evelyn folded the note carefully and placed it inside her desk drawer before turning toward the skyline one final time. Below her, thousands of people moved through the city believing status, wealth, and titles defined importance. But inside one quiet tower overlooking Chicago, an entire company had learned something far more valuable. True character is revealed not by how people treat the powerful, but by how they treat the person they believe has none at all. And that day, everyone inside Holloway Financial Group finally understood what dignity looked like.